Welcome back to Adventures in Theater History. Here on this show, we bring you the best stories from the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm your host, Peter Schmitz. Our original theme music is by Christopher Mark Colucci. Come along with us as we continue our Season 3 and tell the story of Philadelphia, the tryout town. This episode, we're really focusing on the family of businessmen who were more powerful and influential than any others in 20th century American theater, the Shuberts. May 12th, 1905. In the dark, early morning hours, there was a horrible train wreck south of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. A speeding express passenger train, heading west on the main line, had plowed into some cars from a freight train that had buckled and derailed on a parallel track. The passenger carriages careened off down the Susquehanna riverbank, which was bad enough, but it turned out that one of those buckled freight cars contained a load of dynamite. Within seconds, there was a huge explosion, and many of the derailed cars on both trains caught fire. Though some people managed to scramble out of the wreckage, others were trapped in their sleeping berths and burned to death. 22 in all were killed, and 150 others were injured. American newspapers were full of stories about the wreck for days thereafter, the all-too-familiar procession of articles of sudden death, miraculous survival, loss, and the fickleness of random fate. But one victim was mentioned in almost every story. Sam S. Shubert was among the dead. Sam Shubert had been on his way to Pittsburgh to argue before a local court in a dispute with the Shuberts' business rivals, the Theatrical Syndicate. The Syndicate were the group of New York and Philadelphia producers led by the ruthless Abe Erlinger, who, as we discussed back in episode 43, then controlled most of the theaters in America. The Shuberts aimed to break that control. But now Sam Shubert, the most imaginative and creative mind of the three Shubert brothers, was gone. It had been almost a quarter century since the Szymanski family arrived in America, refugees from Czerwient, Lithuania, fleeing the brutal anti-Jewish pogroms that were sweeping the Russian Empire in the early 1880s. The family had been renamed by an American immigration officer who was unwilling or unable to spell Szymanski, and who was annoyed by the father, David's Yiddish pronunciation of his home village. Czerwient became Shurwent, and finally Shubert. There's your name now. Welcome to America. Of course, unlike the famous composer, there was no C there between the S and the H, but the family just shrugged and accepted it. It was all part of building their new life in America. And the Shuberts ended up settling in the northern industrial city of Syracuse, New York. David proved to be a terrible provider and a chronic alcoholic, so the first years for the family were ones of grinding, abject poverty, lessened only by the grudging charity from their Jewish neighbors. While their mother and sister took in laundry and did sewing, the eldest boy, Levi, just 10 years old, fought his way into the one space in the city he could earn money to support the family, the pavement in front of Syracuse's Wheating Theater, which then, like most American theaters of its day, mainly hosted touring productions from New York City, but also had its own small stock company. For 12 hours a day, whatever the weather, or however little he had had to eat, Levi shined shoes, sold newspapers, and every night there was a performance. He ran to open rich theater-goers' carriage doors for them in exchange for tips. By unremitting, grinding work, Levi was clearing maybe a few dollars a day. His younger brothers Shmuel and Jacob joined him, pooling their information and their incomes. And eventually that little patch of theatrical real estate, that sliver of public sidewalk between the curb and the front entrance of the theater, became the foundation of everything that was to come later in their lives. Eventually, the kind-hearted treasurer of the theater's box office noticed the heroic struggles of the skinny and energetic boys warming their hands on the small fire they would light in a bucket there by the curb. And he invited them inside the building. He gave them real jobs. The Shuberts were on their way. Ten years later, barely out of their teens, the three Shubert brothers, assisted by their growing group of friends and a few cunning Syracuse investors, were already booking theatrical tours across upstate New York, expanding to Utica and Rochester and Albany. They now had dropped their old world first names and were calling themselves Lee, Sam, and Jake, though they had only the barest of formal educations. Lee had developed a real head for numbers and contracts. Sam, who modeled his look and manner after the great Jewish director, playwright, and producer David Belasco, who had come through town one day, was the most artistic of the trio. Jake, or JJ, from whom the other two kept a wary distance, was full of truculent violence on occasions, but he liked money and he could make money, and he was always part of the family business. Having literally struggled up from the street, from the gutter, they were all very canny about how to use every possible advantage from every opportunity they got. Using a loan from a local haberdashery store owner, the Shuberts organized the tour of a play they got rights to. They leased a few theaters, and they bought a few others. By 1900, they even made a sudden dash into the theatrical mecca of Manhattan and bought the lease on the then unprofitable Herald Square Theater at 36th Street and Broadway, way up above the popular theater district, which was then still further down in the 20s along Broadway. But just like everything else, they somehow managed to make a success of it. So the Shuberts' rise began literally right at the beginning of the 20th century. Now you may notice that nowhere so far in this narrative have we mentioned Philadelphia, but the very first show the Shuberts staged on Broadway in New York was something called the Brixton Burglary, a minor British farce they'd gotten the rights to. Amazingly, that play became the first real leading role for Lionel Barrymore, one of the most well-known offspring of Philadelphia's famous Drew Barrymore clan, all of which, by this point, had, quite understandably, left the rather moribund theatrical market of Philadelphia and were plying the family trade from New York City. Of the three famous offspring of Maurice and Georgiana Drew Barrymore, young Ethel Barrymore was already a rising young star, shepherded into the stage by her famous uncle, the Broadway actor and beau brummel John Drew. Ethel was a leading lady of the most classy producer of the theatrical syndicate, Charles Frohman, who also still gave the occasional job to her dad, Maurice Barrymore. But Ethel was the real hot property, already appearing regularly in plays both in New York and in London. Her brothers, John and Lionel, however, were still struggling to get started in life, dabbling in drawing and music, and for the most part completely untrained for the stage, with only their family name as capital. In his autobiography, written 50 years later, Lionel Barrymore recounts the way he broke in with the Shuberts. Having left the Coldwater flat that he then shared on West 30th Street with two other struggling young actors to pound the pavement and make the rounds of producers' offices, as the expression went, and excuse me now as I do my best Lionel Barrymore impression, he was grabbing a quick bite to eat when someone said to him, "Barrymore, a couple of newcomers from Syracuse are going to put on a show. Why don't you go over and see them?" I gulped my lemonade and ran to the nearest exit, presenting myself somewhat breathless before Sam Shubert. He was a small, harassed man and did not impress me. I told him I could act. "What is your salary?" he asked. Now, up to this time in my career, actors of my stature who received $50 a week were doing handsomely. Most of the time, I'd been delighted to accept 35. But I thought, what the hell? We'll give this thing a try. So I said, $75 a week. Sam survived my vaulting request. Possibly. He thought he was getting Ethel. This is a dressy part, you know, he said. And by that, Sam Shubert was telling Lionel Barrymore that he'd have to pay for his own costumes, despite the fact that the young actor had, at the time, no decent clothes at all, besides the one he was presently wearing. Barrymore nonchalantly shrugged, he says, indicating that he was fine with the arrangement. Sam Shubert shrugged back at him, offered him a job, and told him rehearsal started tomorrow. Lionel Barrymore's work ethic, however, was very different from that of the almost maniacally possessed Shubert brothers. One day, feeling lazy, Lionel stayed in bed rather than go to rehearsal. Now remember, at that time, actors were not paid to rehearse, and he wouldn't get that $75 a week until the show opened. Anyway, soon enough, he found his motivation to rise when Sam Shubert himself suddenly appeared, banging at his apartment door and barging into his room. "What the hell's the matter with you, Barrymore?" Sam demanded. "Get up, get out of here, come to work. How can you ever expect to mount to anything lying there stinking in bed?" "He then pleaded with me to be a better boy," recalled Lionel. "It astonishes me to recall this scene. This was the great Sam Shubert, the founder of the syndicate. It was as if Louis B. Mayer were to rout me out of bed today." And there I'll end my Barrymore impression. But, you know, Schubert's tactics worked. Lionel did get rehearsal, and on May 20th, 1901, the Brixton Burglary opened at the Herald Square Theatre. Lionel got fairly decent notices, the show ran for 45 performances, and then went on tour. And best of all, it made money. Both the Barrymores and the Shubert family fortune were on their way up from that point. Lee and J.J., still running the theaters back upstate, were well pleased with the results of their enterprising brothers' venture. And they were, all of them, beginning to attract attention. Again and again, the theater syndicate tried to swat the Schuberts aside, tried to ruin them, tried to co-opt them. Abe Erlanger finally assigned the two Philadelphian members of this club, Nixon and Zimmerman, to co-produce shows with them, and then to squeeze them out and toss them aside. But it was Nixon and Zimmerman who eventually had to give up. The Schuberts had a fierce team of young lawyers on their side and a keen eye for buying up otherwise marginal theatrical real estate and making it pay. Soon they controlled theaters in Chicago and St. Louis, even London. And from a distressed New York producer, they got control of the Lyric Theater in Manhattan. They were learning the privileges of being eligible young male producers of successful shows, too. Now, it isn't often mentioned in the theater history textbooks, but the sexual privileges of being a male theater producer back in those days was, to us today, appalling, but back then, to them, appealing. It was a transactional situation. A lot of pretty young women wanted to get a start in showbiz, and it was widely acknowledged that they could get that start in exchange for sex. You may remember that the Charlotte Cushman Society was founded in Philadelphia at about this time to provide a refuge from just this sort of thing. But not all women at the time were averse to this system, because once a girl had gotten cast in a show and was placed in a small role or in a chorus line in alluring costumes, they could then try to attract the attention of what was then called the bald-headed rose, the rich middle-aged men who came to the theater just to meet Corines and ingenues, and maybe they could eventually date them, and even, more often than you might think, marry them. It was a way up in the social ladder, and it accounted for the horror that a lot of respectable families regarded life in the theater for their own offspring, or the discomfort when their Uncle Wilberforce or something announced that he'd met a girl from the chorus of the Follies, and it was love, true love, I tell you. But going back to the Schuberts, they and other producers of the day like Florenz Ziegfeld and Earl Carroll and so on took full advantage of their control of that all-important first step into showbiz. A lot of girls cycled in and out of the handy beds in rooms adjacent to their offices. Lee and J.J. especially. All three Schuberts also took advantage of the lack of record-keeping and documentation of their real origins. On insurance policies, they always claimed to be born in America, and their ages were always changing. They were always knocking off or adding years as it suited them. By early 1905, somehow, Sam had become the older brother of the trio instead of the middle one, and they were building their reputations in the press, too, using the narrative that they were the heroic battlers against the monopolistic theatrical syndicate. They even started their own theatrical newspaper, which came in especially handy after the syndicate's Iroquois Theater in Chicago caught fire in late 1903, killing over 600 people. Public distaste for the old-school producers grew even more heated after that, and such great theater artists as Richard Mansfield, Mrs. Fisk, Sarah Bernhardt, and Sam's hero, David Belasco, started working exclusively with the Schuberts instead. And then, of course, Sam took that fateful train to Pittsburgh in May of 1905. In the aftermath, the two remaining brothers, Lee and Jake, were gutted. It seemed like there was nothing left to do but to give up, to sell out to Erlanger and abandon the field. How could they go on without Sam? And then, gathering strength again, they began to buy and build. They would do it for Sam, who they, from this point on, referred to as their late oldest brother, even though he wasn't. They invariably referred to him as Sam S. Shubert, even though he had never had a middle name. He may have been gone, but they wouldn't let his dream, or the false statements they had entered on insurance documents, die. Most of this new expansion took place in New York, Chicago, Boston, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. The Schuberts were buying up theaters, buying lots on which they might later put theaters, buying theaters they would later tear down and make into apartments, whatever worked. They were also producing revues and operettas and plays at a furious pace. Not the best ones, admittedly, but the ones they did usually made money. They brought in new partners. An infusion of cash from a couple of Ohio River Valley businessmen did a lot to increase their working capital. They began forming a web of shell companies and interlocking partnerships. They invested in ticket brokerage firms, set construction studios, theatrical costume shops, lobby restaurants and bars, transfer companies. Wherever there was a buck to be made in the theater business, they wanted a piece of it. But what about their supposed implacable war with the theatrical syndicate? Well, the syndicate, though still hugely profitable and largely maintaining its dominant position in the legitimate theatrical market, was a little distracted by then. First, there were several antitrust lawsuits being brought against them, which they had to defend. And right about then, Abe Erlanger was obsessively trying to break into the vaudeville business, too. He had seen the millions and millions that B.F. Keith was making in variety theaters and from his central booking office, and he wanted some of that money, too. There's nothing a monopolist hates so much as another monopolist who is not giving him a cut. While all this was going on, the Schuberts, likewise determined to become monopolists themselves, held off the syndicate by signing a 10-year peace treaty with them, agreeing not to compete in certain cities, including Philadelphia. Though secretly, they were backing their friend, the furrier Marcus Lowe, who was engaging in what was inevitably called the Philadelphia Vaudeville War between him, Keith, and the syndicate. Eventually, by 1913, this war ended in a truce. Marcus Lowe got out of vaudeville, and they went into the movie theater business. The Schuberts owned some shares of that, too. We already described back in episode 46, when we were discussing impresario Oscar Hammerstein and the Philly theater buildings during the other war of that era, the Opera War. We briefly mentioned how the Schuberts had built the twin Adelphi and Lyric theaters side by side just north of City Hall. And that was very much like them then, taking over slightly less advantageous real estate and turning it to their advantage. The Lyric and the Adelphi became the anchors in the growing Shubert chain of touring houses in Philadelphia, hosting productions that were coming in and out of New York. Their friend and associate Morris Guest also used the Lyric for temporarily hosting prestigious foreign company tours like the Abbey Players from Dublin in 1912 and the Moscow Art Theatre in 1923. We also mentioned in that past episode how the Shuberts invested with the syndicate in the first Forest Theatre, the one on South Broad Street, but they didn't really control it, which they hated. That was prime theatrical real estate, as was the Garrick Theatre, just to its north, and the old Moorish-themed Broad Street Theatre to the south, across from the Academy of Music. Nixon and Zimmerman still controlled these. But those two longtime partners, who had been in business for decades now, were getting old and slipping. Their older theaters that were their core business badly needed renovation. Some, like the Park up in North Philadelphia and the Chestnut Street Theater, closed down. Some became movie theaters. And as the two old partners eventually went permanently to inhabit their long-prepared family mausoleums and Philadelphia cemeteries, their sons and heirs had other priorities. Fred Nixon Nerdlinger Jr., for example, became one of those sugar daddies who used the family theatrical fortune to entice one of those ambitious young beauties who crossed a stage that he owned in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He even married her, although in the long run this romance did not work out very well for him. She eventually shot him to death at their villa in the south of France in 1931. But that's a story we'll definitely have to tell in greater detail another day. Getting back to the Shuberts, in the year 1917, they managed to get the lease of the old Chestnut Street Opera House, which was now just down the block from the busy and palatial Keith's Vaudeville Theatre. To revivify this new investment, the Shuberts heavily altered the old Victorian interior of the Opera House in a similar way that we described the total renovation of the Walnut Street Theatre in 1920. The Chestnut Street Opera House got a new neoclassical facade too, the better for advertising its first show of the Shubert era, a new operetta called You're in Love, produced by Oscar's son, Arthur Hammerstein, of all people. The Shuberts and the Hammersteins always had a great faith in the commercial potential of operettas. You didn't have to hire expensive stars in them, and the composer, who often would conduct, was generally underpaid, or paid not at all, frankly. Nonetheless, it was soon followed by all the Shubert girly reviews of that era, such as Artists and Models, or The Passing Show, or The Greenwich Village Follies, or Mae West's The Whirl of the Town. As Lee and J.J. continued to build and acquire theater spaces in New York and elsewhere in America, they often named them after Sam. There were soon Sam S. Shubert Memorial Theaters in many American cities. They put one in New York, of course, the Shubert Theater on Shubert Alley, which still stands today, glorious place. Their main house, their pride and joy, however, was the Winter Garden up on the north side of the burgeoning Times Square Theater District. Amazingly, all this success happened as Lee and J.J. had completely stopped speaking to each other. They just hated each other from that point on in their lives. They maintained separate offices across the street from each other, and their various minions and secretaries would spend all day going back and forth between the two powerful men, delicately, of course, admitting the abusive insults they tended to scream about their stupid SOB of a brother. Besides the last name on the marquee and Sam's photograph hung reverently in the lobby, you could always tell a Shubert theater by going down to the public washrooms during intermission and trying the hot water taps on the bathroom sink. They never worked. The brothers saw no reason to fire up boilers just to heat water when people were in a hurry to get back to their seats, and they could just as easily use the cold water tap. Oh, plus there were complimentary drinking water fountains, but if you wanted a paper cup to actually drink from them, well, then you had to pay a penny. By this point, the Shuberts' 10-year truce with the syndicate had now expired. Charles Frohman had died in the Lusitania, and sensing that Erlanger's allies were falling by the wayside one by one, the Shuberts made their big move. In 1918, the Shubert Brothers wanted to build a Sam S. Shubert Memorial Theater in Philadelphia, too. So they bought the stunningly beautiful 20-year-old Horticultural Hall from the high society folks at the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, directly to the south of the old Academy of Music. Under the design plans of their in-house architect, a man named Herbert Krapp, K-R-A-P-P. I don't write these jokes, folks. I just report them. The building, long a home for society balls and exhibitions, was mostly demolished. True, the ornate interior staircase and part of the back wall was preserved and rebuilt as a brand sparkling new pre-Broadway tryout house, the Sam S. Shubert Theater. The first show ever produced at Philadelphia's Sam S. Shubert Memorial Theater in late August of 1918 was Chu Chin Chow, which had been a hit in London and had been staged on a mammoth scale. It was an Orientalist piece of escapist fluff. It had run for a year in New York as well, and although the title, Chu Chin Chow, sounds now to our ears like it might have been a cringy setting in ancient China, actually, even worse, it was about a Chinese character named Chow, but the cringy setting was in ancient Baghdad. So, both Chinese and Arab. The whole plot was mostly stolen from the play Kismet and was kind of a predecessor to Timbuktu, that, as we mentioned in our holiday episode, would so many years later play in that exact same theater. Speaking of callbacks, Florence Reed, the Philadelphia-born granddaughter of Pop Reed, the famous old prop man at the Walnut Street Theater, was leading the cast. Here's a report of the evening, verbatim, as it appeared in the Philadelphia Evening Public Ledger, filled with breathless prose that sounds like it was fed to them directly from the Shubert Public Relations Office, which it probably was. Wonders of Orient in Chu Chin Chow. Capacity House sees opening of new Shubert Theater with gorgeous spectacle. When the most fantastic of fairy tales becomes riotous reality, anything is possible. Our own austere and venerable William Penn evidently realizes this quite well. At any rate, he never turned a hair when the clock beneath his feet on City Hall Tower last night swung back, making the world's most ancient author of fairy tales the inaugural spirit of Philadelphia's newest and, in the opinion of many, handsomest theater. For it might truly be said that Scheherazade formally opened the new Sam S. Shubert Memorial Theater on South Broad Street, for it was one of the most gorgeously imaginative fables of old Baghdad that was most gorgeously bodied forth when the long-heralded Chu Chin Chow made a record-breaking house forget for more than 3 solid hours whether it was the heat or the humidity. Florence Reed as the slave girl, who is the pivotal figure in accomplishing the ruin of the robber chief masquerading as Chu Chin Chow, the merchant, contributed the single piece of intense acting. She is ideally suited to the role and played it with authority. Much attention was bestowed by the audience upon the beautiful lines of the theater and its tasteful color scheme of old rose and gray with gold decoration, as well as the spacious stairway, which has been preserved, evoked praise. A large portrait of the late Sam S. Shubert adorns the black and white marble lobby, and after the performance, Miss Reed read a glowing tribute to the man whom the playhouse honors, and to the part played by him and his firm in the affairs of the theater. Well, Old Horticultural Hall wasn't the last Philly landmark to fall to the Shuberts. By the mid-1920s, they had become one of the largest theatrical business concerns in the world. They were the new syndicate. The Shubert Circuit, by that point, had 86 first-class theaters in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, New Haven, and 25 other cities. They could seat 130,000 theatergoers a night, with returns of up to $1 million a week. Lee claimed that he and J.J. controlled about 60% of high-class theater in the U.S. and Canada. Pretty soon, they planned to go public, and the Shubert shares would be quickly snapped up on the New York Stock Exchange. Lee was being consulted on business projects in Hollywood and helped broker the merger, which created Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Though Philadelphia was just a small part of their vast empire, they did not neglect it. In 1927, the long-standing arrangement between the syndicate and the Shuberts was over, so the Forest Theater was sold and it was completely demolished to be replaced by the enormous Fidelity Trust building, now owned by Wells Fargo. To replace its function, however, two theaters emerged. First, the Erlanger Theater, which we'll talk about another day, was being built on Market Street, while the Shuberts constructed the second Forest Theater on 11th and Walnut Street. That, unlike the Erlanger, still stands today. Again, the architect of this new Forest Theater was Herbert Krapp, and the building project was managed by a new Shubert, a character that we need to introduce into our ongoing annals of Philadelphia theater history. Lee and J.J. Shubert, like many self-made men, trusted their childhood friends and their family above everybody else. Even if they weren't the brightest bulbs in the box, their loyalty could be counted on. Their oldest sister, Fanny, had a son named Larry Isaacs, who was born in Syracuse in 1895, or maybe 1894. Again, there's that Shubert fudging of dates. Larry's father may or may not have been Isaac Isaacs, who married Fanny Shubert right around then. Many sources I've seen say that Fanny's other son, Milton, was Larry's half-brother only, at any rate. But when Larry was a teenager, his Uncle Jake hired him and put him to work as a treasurer in the Winter Garden Theater in New York. But Larry, was not regarded by his uncles as a very bright light, and he was soon exiled out of New York and off to Philadelphia to become the treasurer of the Lyric Theater. And in Philadelphia, Larry did okay, or at least well enough. He, too, began pursuing young female dancers that flocked around the theater, and he caught one. Or maybe it was the other way around. Anyway, Larry married Frances Summerfield, sometimes called herself Frances von Summerfield, a trained ballerina, in 1915. He seems to have converted to the Episcopal Church in order to marry her, too. From then on, in fact, Larry did everything to become as much like an old family Philadelphia wasp as possible. Bought a big house in the Tony suburb of Marion. In early January 1919, Larry legally changed his name from Lawrence Shubert Isaacs to Lawrence Shubert Lawrence. And with that triple-barreled moniker, Lawrence Shubert Lawrence, he went through the rest of his life. His wife was now invariably referred to in the Philadelphia Society columns as Mrs. Lawrence Shubert Lawrence. He named their only son Lawrence Shubert Lawrence Jr. and sent him off to Episcopal Academy and the University of Pennsylvania, naturally. Uncle Lee was still loyal to him, though, and he put Larry in charge of the construction of the new Forest Theater project on Walnut Street, despite the fact that by this point he didn't have much confidence in this Philadelphia branch of his family and his waspy social register aspirations. I got a brother, JJ. He's an idiot, but not intentionally, Lee once told a trusted employee. Then Lee shook his head. But I got a nephew, Lawrence. He's an idiot, intentionally. Uncle J.J. Shubert, for his part, often fired Lawrence Shubert Lawrence when he was mad about something stupid his nephew had done down in Philadelphia, but then his Uncle Lee would hire him back again. Supposedly, one of the stupidest things that the pair considered that Lawrence Shubert Lawrence had ever done was during the construction of the new Forest Theater. Supposedly, he had forgotten to include backstage dressing rooms in his original plans, and these had to be added later at much expense by buying an adjacent building and then digging an underground tunnel from it so that the performers could get from their dressing rooms to the stage and back. Now, I'm not sure that story is correct, actually. It may just have been the shape of the lot required some original spacing, and certainly the architect, Herbert Krapp, was too experienced by this point to miss such a glaring thing. No dressing rooms? I mean, his name was Krapp, but his designs really were stunning, as anyone who visits the Forest Theater today. Still, a beautiful, well-kept jewel in the Shubert Organization theatrical empire can attest. What did it look like? Well, as the faithful chronicler of Philadelphia theater buildings, the late Irving R. Glazer once wrote, "The interiors are a symphony of marble, crystal, and red plush. The elegant entrance lobby has a green base with sky rose above. The coffered ceiling has individual basket-type crystal fixtures. The lofty foyer has an arched covelet ceiling, crystal fixtures, and delicate touches of gold and silver leaf. A great marble staircase rises at the far end. The auditorium is done in Adams style in shades of old rose and gray. Crystal ceiling fixtures and wall fixtures are everywhere. The orchestra, Glaser tells us, seated 60 players. The proscenium was 40 feet wide, and overall it seated 1,800 people. May 1st, 1928, to match the splendor of the new Forest Theater's house. The Red Robe, a lavishly produced operetta, of course, was the first play ever staged at the brand new Forest. The Red Robe was a musical adaptation of a play entitled Under the Red Robe, itself adapted from a popular novel by Stanley Weyman. The Shuberts liked multiple layers of adaptation. They figured that once 3 or 4 authors had had a crack at a script, it had real quality. And as I said, the Shubert Brothers also set great store by European-style operettas, and this was surely one of their most grandly produced works. The music was by the composer Jean Gilbert, who was present at the Forest that night and conducted the orchestra. The book and the lyrics were by the American writer Harry B. Gilbert, apparently no relation to his creative partner Gilbert. Walter Wolfe played the role of the swashbuckling hero named Gilles de Barrot, and his love interest, René de Cocheforest, was played by the young Evelyn Herbert. Wrote the Inquirer, Philadelphia's latest playhouse to bid for public approval, the New Forest, located on Walnut Street between 11th and 12th, opened its doors last night before a representative, quite brilliant audience, with Mayor Mackey and others prominent in public and social life in attendance. Although there were no speeches or other ceremonies except a brief announcement just before the final act began, at 11 o'clock, that the composer, Jean Gilbert, would conduct it. It was the consensus of the audience's opinion that the sumptuous new theater was another step in the progress this city is making in the way of inviting playhouses, where the public may receive its relaxation from the routine business cares in enjoyment of splendid attractions. And there we go. That's our show for today. As we shall see in the future, the Shuberts, who are now well established in Philadelphia, would almost completely dominate the local commercial theater market for the next 4 decades. We'll be back again next month with some more episodes, probably a series of shorter ones detailing various shows that tried out or had their world premieres in Philadelphia during the 1920s and 1930s, in Shubert houses mostly, because that's mostly all there was. Though we'll also talk about the Erlanger Theater too, and all the new combination movie and stage theaters being built by the Mastbaums. The sound editing and engineering was all done today by my humble self here at our studios in our world headquarters, high atop the Tower of Theater History. If you've been enjoying this season of the podcast or have any thoughts or suggestions, would you drop us an email at aithpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. To support our show and to get access to bonus material and special insider info about Philly theater history, our Patreon page is patreon.com/AITH podcast. Or another way to thank us is to leave some stars and a review about the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you can. You can do that right on our website, www.aithpodcast.com. That helps us out so much. Thank you. And while you're visiting the website, check out the blog post for this episode. We'll share some images of the Shuberts and many of the theaters and events and performers that we talked about today. Thank you for listening and for coming along on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.